Okay, if you are joining us on the live stream, welcome. And online, BelAirChurchOfChrist.org, under Media, Bible Class Material is where you can find the handout. And as we've been doing, these handouts will be posted a couple days ahead of time. There's also on there, which is being passed out, a reading schedule, which is partly just to alert you to when we're covering what in the class, but also gives you a schedule to be reading throughout the course of the class. This is a half-quarter class, so this is just 6.5 weeks. It'll get us through the middle of January, and then there'll be another class that starts then. And so 12 classes or so to get through the book of Judges. Seems like it's never enough time, but it will at least give us a chance to do a good survey of the book and hopefully walk away with some good information and good things to take into our hearts and minds to be better. And that's where we're going to start. We're talking about goals of the class. That should say goals, plural. But 3 things I'll offer to you, and we'll try to refer back to these as we go, because this is really the point of studying the Bible, is to grow, to change, to be better. And that's what these goals represent. And so, firstly, we want to avoid the destructive cycle of sin. That's, as we're going to see even tonight, is really one of the main themes of the book of Judges, if not the main theme. The destructive cycle of sin. And it was true. It happened then. It happens now. And we want to be able to avoid that destructive cycle for ourselves, for our families, and in our churches as well. And the flip side of that, because we're not just trying to avoid the negative and avoid the negative example that we see in the book of Judges, but we're also trying to build something positive. And so, to that end, we want to cultivate a trust in God. We could say a genuine and authentic trust in God that grows from generation to generation, as opposed to something that breaks down after a generation or two. And so, let's be thinking about that. I don't know how often we think in our families or in our churches, think about generational sustainability, the faith, passing it down, not just to our kids, to our grandkids, equipping our kids and our grandkids to pass it down to their kids and grandkids. But the book of Judges has some profound things to teach us along those lines. And so we hope to avoid the bad and to hope to create the good. And maybe at the center of all of that is Jesus, obviously. And one of the things we'll see in Judges is that the lack of a king, specifically the lack of a good king, is at the heart of why the nation fails from generation to generation. And so we want to, in looking at some of these graphic, ugly pictures of sin in the book of Judges, and they are graphic and they are ugly, if you remember, we want to see our need, our desperate need for a king, for King Jesus, and recognize the world's desperate need for Jesus, his authority, his kingship. So we'll hopefully work towards this. In terms of objectives, these are like the facts, the things that I could test you on, and I might actually at some point. But we'll do a pre-test to see how we'll... So shout out. I don't know if we're doing microphones or not, but at least shout out. Let's see how many of these we can get. Can you list all 12 judges? So there's kind of like 6 major judges, 6 minor judges. The major ones are easier. Let's do it as a class. Yell out one if you have it. Othniel. I always heard Othniel, but Othniel, Lee says. Ehud. I'm not putting Shamgar as a major. He has 1 verse, so. Yeah. Samson is the last one. Jephthah is the 5th one. Samuel doesn't... I struggled with Samuel, but he's not in the book of Judges, so we're not going to include him in our list. We had Ehud, Deborah, and one more, Gideon. Okay. So the major judges, that is, that we have more than just a verse or a mention of them. Othniel, Ehud, Deborah, Gideon, Jephthah, Samson. There's 6 minor judges. Shamgar's one. The other ones are harder. That's like the Ibzans and the Elons of the world. and Tola and Jer, Abdon toward the end. So hopefully by the end you can say all of those in order. And Muffy's right. It is easier just to go in order, really. Then there's 2 extra leaders of note that are not technically judges, but we talk about them in the book of Judges. Anybody remember who they are? Yeah, Barak, however you want to say that. And there's like a bad leader who's not really a judge because he's awful and kills a bunch of people and gets a millstone thrown on his head. Abimelech. He is the son of Gideon. Well, he is a judge, but he's not in Judges. Shannon had said the same thing. But we're going to only stick with the ones in the book that we're studying. So yeah, maybe by the end you could do all that on your own fairly easily. Name the enemy defeated by each judge and the unique events in the story. So we talked about the millstone one. What about the judge that had his knife swallowed up by the intestines of the king? Ehud, yeah. And let's see, what about the judge who had a fleece on the ground and it was dry in the morning and the ground was wet, and vice versa? Gideon, right? So there's a lot of unique stories, and so it seems like if we can match up the unique stories and the enemies with the judge, then that'll help us to just remember the events, which then help us to get the message of the story as well. The 4-part sin cycle. Anybody want to just go ahead and nail that right now so we have it in our minds? Rebellion against God or sin, that leads to, the suffering of the people, pleading to God for help, and, salvation. So Brian will be happy to know I have an alliteration for you later on. So explain the overall trajectory of the collection of the stories in Judges. So this is not like each story kind of follows that pattern that we just described, but there's also an overall trajectory. That means if you put the stories all together in a line, there is a pattern, there is a flow that we want to pay attention to. We'll get to that later today. There's 2 stories at the end of Judges that are very unfamiliar to us, but they are very important. They take up quite a bit of material at the end of the book. The story of Micah and the Danites. That's not a band, that's a story. And then the story of the men of Gibeah, the concubine that is violated, and then the tribe of Benjamin and how they get into a predicament that has to be solved at the end of the book. Very odd, very horrible stories at the end of the book of Judges. Less familiar. So by the end of the class, I hope I could ask you that and you could tell me those stories fairly easily. And then the last one is to, by the end of the class, and maybe some of you can do it now, whether you realize it or not, recite Judges 21:25. Anybody? That's the last verse of the book. Anybody know what that says? We'll do fill in the blank. Do you have it, Granny? In those days there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Yeah. So there you go. You knew it. Some of you knew it, even though you didn't know it. But by the end, you should be able to know that's the last statement of the book, and this is word for word what it says. Okay, that's what we hope to accomplish. Let's talk about this. If you did look at your handout, this is the first couple things I asked you to work on, and that is, remember that Judges, so the story of Gideon, for instance, is like one story, and then within the book of Judges, there's all these stories. But then Judges is one piece of a larger story of the Old Testament. And so we want to kind of understand where we are in the context of this larger story that's being told in the Old Testament. So who wants to take a crack at this? What is the book of Deuteronomy about? Okay. Moses saying goodbye is one. Brian says the law. Where does the book of Deuteronomy take place? Yes, before they enter the promised land, they're on the verge of the promised land in the plains of Moab, specifically. And what happens? Moses gives them the law. Why does he need to give them the law? I thought they already had it from Exodus and Leviticus. It's a new generation. Why is it a new generation? The old generation's been killed off because of their sin, okay? So Moses is leaving them at the doorstep they're receiving the law again. And what is his kind of main message for them as he leaves them? Yeah. Keep the covenant, keep the commandments, obey God. So this is it in a nutshell, basically. At the promised land, reminding them what God has done. That is a big part of this. Reiterating those deliverances from the past, Egypt and so on. Reminding them of that and reiterating the law, the covenant, the terms of the covenant. Encourages them to trust in God, be faithful. Promises that the enemies will be driven out in front of them with no problem if they will just trust in God. And warns, though, that there are consequences of disobedience. Okay, what's the book of Joshua all about? Crossing over, invading. How does it go? They're well committed, yeah. Is it perfect? No, it's not. There are some missteps along the way. Do you remember some of those missteps? Yeah, I'm going to miss the order here, but I guess Achan comes first, right? He is taking what God said not to take from Jericho. Michael refers to the Gibeonites who they made a covenant with and were fooled by their old ratty clothes. And they made a covenant. God had said, don't make covenants with these people, destroy them. So there are some missteps along the way, but they win great victories. And I don't think I've said this before, but Joshua to me is one of the most disappointing books in the Bible, because you start reading it and you're like, oh, it's so action-packed. There's so much cool things going on. And then you get about halfway through and the rest of it is just like a list of places. And it's like, this is the tribe of, Naphtali got this area. The tribe of Asher got this area. And that becomes less exciting. But the point is they divide up the territory among the tribes. And the book of Joshua ends, and if you're open to Judges, you're seeing it right there in front of you. We will serve the Lord. Joshua implores the people to say, be faithful to God, keep his covenant. In many ways, he's just doing what Moses did one book earlier and encouraging the people to be faithful to God's covenant. Okay, so let's jump into Judges. You guys know how I feel about reading the text. I think it's important. So I'm going to go ahead and just read all of chapter 1. And here's a map. Maybe you can see that. Maybe you can't. But if you're at home, maybe you can see it better. But we're going to read the first chapter. And there's a lot in here about the ongoing conquest of the land. And so we'll try not to get lost too much in the weeds here. But I'm just going to read it from beginning to end. And as we go, ask yourself some of the questions we've just talked about with Joshua. How are they doing as they enter into the land? Where are they doing well? What are the bright spots? Who is doing well? And what's the general situation as they have just kind of planted themselves into the land of Canaan that God had promised them. Judges 1, here we go. Now it came about after the death of Joshua that the sons of Israel inquired of the Lord, saying, who shall go up first for us against the Canaanites to fight against them? The Lord said, Judah shall go up. Behold, I have given the land into his hand. Then Judah said to Simeon his brother, come with me into the territory allotted me, that we may fight against the Canaanites, and I in turn will go with you into the territory allotted you. So Simeon went up with him. Judah went up, and the Lord gave the Canaanites and the Perizzites into his hands, and they defeated 10,000 men at Bezek. They found Adoni-Bezek in Bezek and fought against him, and they defeated the Canaanites and the Perizzites. But Adoni-Bezek fled, and they pursued him and caught him and cut off his thumbs and big toes. Adoni-Bezek said, 70 kings with their thumbs and their big toes cut off used to gather up scraps under my table as I have done. So God has repaid me. So they brought him to Jerusalem and he died there. So don't cut off people's big toes, when you conquer them, because you'll be next, is the moral of that. Verse 8, then the sons of Judah fought against Jerusalem and captured it and struck it with the edge of the sword and set the city on fire. Afterward, the sons of Judah went down to fight against the Canaanites living in the hill country and in the Negev and the lowland. So Judah went against the Canaanites who lived in Hebron. Now the name of Hebron formerly was Kiriath Arba, and they struck Sheshai and Ahiman and Talmai. Then from there he went against the inhabitants of Debir, Now the name of Debir formerly was Kiriath Sepher, and Caleb said, remember who Caleb was, right? He is the other faithful spy with Joshua, an old man now. And Caleb said, verse 12, the one who attacks Kiriath Sepher and captures it, I will give him my daughter Achsah for a wife. Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, captured it, so he gave him his daughter Achsah for a wife. Then it came about when she came to him that she persuaded him to ask her father for a field. And she alighted from her donkey, and Caleb said to her, what do you want? She said to him, give me a blessing, since you have given me the land of the Negev. Give me also springs of water. So Caleb gave her the upper springs and the lower springs. The descendants of the Kenite, Moses' father-in-law, went up from the city of palms with the sons of Judah to the wilderness of Judah, which is in the south of Arad. And they went and lived with the people. Then Judah went with Simeon his brother, and they struck the Canaanites living in Zephath and utterly destroyed it. So the name of the city is called Hormah. And Judah took Gaza with its territory, Ashkelon with its territory, and Ekron with its territory. Those are the famous, three of the famous Philistine cities, by the way. Verse 19, now the Lord was with Judah, and they took possession of the hill country, but they could not drive out the inhabitants of the valley because they had iron chariots. Then he gave Hebron to Caleb as Moses had promised, and he drove out from there the three sons of Anak, that's the giant folk. But the sons of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem. So the Jebusites have lived with the sons of Benjamin in Jerusalem to this day. Likewise, the house of Joseph went up against Bethel, and the Lord was with them. The house of Joseph spied out Bethel. Now the name of the city was formerly Luz. The spies saw a man coming out of the city, and they said to him, please show us the entrance to the city, and we will treat you kindly. So he showed them the entrance to the city, and they struck the city with the edge of the sword, but they let the man and all his family go free. The man went into the land of the Hittites and built a city and named it Luz, which is its name to this day. Verse 27, but Manasseh did not take possession of Beth Shean and its villages, and Tanakh and its villages, or the inhabitants of Dor and its villages, the inhabitants of Ibleam and its villages, or the inhabitants of Megiddo and its villages. So the Canaanites persisted in living in that land. Came about when Israel became strong that they put the Canaanites to forced labor, but they did not drive them out completely. Ephraim did not drive out the Canaanites who were living in Gezer, so the Canaanites lived in Gezer among them. Zebulun did not drive out the inhabitants of Kitron or the inhabitants of Nahalai, so the Canaanites lived among them and became subject to forced labor. Asher, disappointingly, did not drive out the inhabitants of Akko, the inhabitants of Sidon, or of Alab, or of Akzib, or Helba, or of Aphik, or of Rehob. So the Asherites lived among the Canaanites and the inhabitants of the land, for they did not drive them out. Naphtali did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh or the inhabitants of Bethanath, but lived among the Canaanites. The inhabitants of the land and the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh and Beth Anath became forced labor for them. Then the Amorites forced the sons of Dan into the hill country, for they did not allow them to come down into the valley. Yet the Amorites persisted in living in Mount Heres, in Ajalon, and Shalbim. But when the power of the house of Joseph grew strong, they became forced labor. The border of the Amorites ran from the ascent of Akrabim from Selah and upward. Okay, so how are we doing so far? So one answer says they started off well, and the other says they disobeyed God. So what do we make of all this here? So Brian goes back to God's command, and that's where we start with Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is very clear about what their responsibility was. But as they settle, as Brian says, it wasn't a complete conquest in the days of Joshua. And so it was up to these people to continue that conquest, and they didn't. But Albert says still they started out well. What's good? What are the bright spots here in Judges chapter 1? Yeah, so notice on your map where that is. And here's Judah down here. Simeon, as you read here in Judges 1, actually, if you ever notice like why Simeon isn't really on the map anywhere, it's kind of because Simeon, the tribe, gets lumped in with Judah pretty early. And Judah says, well, you just come with me, you know. And so they do a good job. And specifically, we have some names of people that are faithful and victorious here in chapter 1. Who are some names? Caleb, again, you know, he's kind of, yeah. And then Othniel, his nephew becomes son-in-law. Othniel is, you know, hey, it's like, remember the story with Caleb? I'll go up and conquer them. He conquers them. And that's the way it is with Othniel, okay? Oh, there's a challenge. Oh, it's kind of like David and Goliath. I mean, it's, you know, hey, there's a challenge. There's land to be conquered. I'll go do it. And he does it. Okay, and that's all happening down here. And then John also mentions the sons of Joseph. Who are the sons of Joseph? You're like, oh, wait, Joseph's not a tribe, you know. Yeah, so, well, actually, there's one more. Sons of Joseph. Sorry, no, I'm thinking of sons of Rachel. I'm a generation back here. Yeah, so Ephraim and Manasseh. And so Ephraim's going to probably be what's in view there. As we go forward in Israelite history, it's really Judah is the big player in the south and Ephraim is the big player in the north. But they do a pretty good job, okay? What about the rest of the tribes?
I was surprised that the text reads very factually, and some of it's like they could not overtake the valley because of the iron chariots. Not they did not. Most of what we read in this period is they did not trust God, and so they could not. And that, I don't know. That was just interesting.
So let me ask you about that, because that specifically one of the places John's referring to, verse 19. Notice the weird kind of formulation of this. Now the Lord was with Judah, and they took possession of the hill country, but they could not drive out the inhabitants of the valley because they had iron chariots. So if God was giving them the victories, why could they not drive out the iron chariots? Right.
Somewhere back in my mind, I'm reading that God did not want them to use horses. I'm sorry. Somewhere in the back of my mind is God did not want them to use horses and chariots, that he wanted them to trust him for their victories. And so you kind of see the pattern when Israel or the Israelites were so successful in conquering Jericho, and then they came across that little village that they couldn't conquer, and I've forgotten the name of it, but it was because of the sin of Achan. God was not with them. So I'm inferring, because I don't recall a specific passage explaining why, that they didn't trust God. And perhaps there was sin in their midst as well.
Can both be true? Can it be true that they trusted God to give them victory, and then they didn't trust God to give them victory? Can both of those things be true? So Brian kind of gives us a good example of that. I mean, if you look at the Jericho Ai incident, okay, they trusted God, and then just right around the corner, they weren't trusting in God. Okay, and we'll see some of that as we go through the book of Judges, or we'll see more of that. This idea that there are maybe levels, there are kind of degrees where a person can trust God, but then with the challenge gets ramped up a little bit more, or they face a bigger enemy or something, then their trust falters, and they trust in themselves, they don't trust in God, and so then they stumble, they fall. And so it could be, I say my take on verse 19 is that even Judah, that did so well, okay, they ran into a problem that their fear became greater than their trust, and they saw those iron chariots, and at that point, their fear kept them from being able to drive out or not drive out the people. So we got Brian, and then we got Albert up here, I think, after Brian.
Yeah, I would just add that as they're approaching the promised land, God made it clear that it was he that was driving out the inhabitants before them, and that he would give them the victories, that they should trust in him and not sin. And clearly, i.e., the city that you now I can now remember since you said it.
No, it's AI, not IE.
IE, or however you want to say it. In any event, sin had entered their midst, and God withdrew from them, and even though they sent an overwhelming force, they were defeated. So I have to infer from that when they didn't have victories, a matter of trust and not being devoted to God. Because God's the one giving them the victory. So if they actually pursue the battle and fail, God did not give them the victory.
He's the constant, so if anything wavers, it's because of them. Albert?
Earlier when I said they started out, well, I look at verse 1 where it says, after the death, they inquired of the Lord, which is premium what we all should be doing, and seeking God's wisdom. And so many times they failed in the other chapters because they didn't do it. And then regarding verse 18, I can't help but think, or was it
19? Yeah.
Yeah, 19. They did take possession, but there's consequences for what they didn't do when they first crossed over. And so driving out the inhabitants is possibly a consequence of not successfully doing what God told them to do in the very beginning.
So let's keep going in that direction then, because chapter 2 says more explicitly the things that we're all saying, inferring from the details given in chapter 1. So chapter 2, 1-5, as we read, ask yourself, what is God's case against his people? How do they respond? There's a conversation here. The angel of the Lord, chapter 2, verse 1, shows up. The angel of the Lord came up from Gilgal to Bochum. He said, I brought you up out of the land of Egypt and led you into the land which I have sworn to your fathers. And I said, I will never break my covenant with you. And as for you, you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You shall tear down their altars. But you have not obeyed me. What is this you have done? Therefore I also said, I will not drive them out before you, but they will become as thorns in your side, and their gods will be a snare to you. And the angel of the Lord spoke these words to all the sons of Israel. The people lifted up their voices and wept. So they named that place Bochum, and there they sacrificed to the Lord. Okay, so God makes his own case. And what does God say to the people here? You didn't obey me. Okay. What else does he say about that? There's kind of so you didn't obey is kind of the force of the message. There's kind of an antecedent, something that sets up this charge. You did not obey me, and then there's the consequence. Therefore this is going to happen. What does he say? What does he use to set up that charge? You do not obey me. What does he say before that? This is it's everywhere in the Old Testament. It's huge. This is always the way God sets up his charges against his people. I made a covenant. I'm not going to break that covenant. And there's one other part of it too, which is, well, yeah, you have to keep it, but I have done this for you. So here's what I've done, right? I led you up out of Egypt, okay? And then I made this promise to you, but you have disobeyed. And so then the consequence of disobedience is, think about how many times in the Bible we see that sort of thing where God just allows the natural consequences of a person's disobedience to unfold to their own destruction. Okay, God says, you didn't drive them out, they're going to stick around. And what's it going to be like? Thorns in your side, yeah. How do the people respond on this occasion? I mean, that sounds good to me, right? Is it a good thing? Is it good that they wept and they made sacrifices? Yeah. Yeah. And those are, of course, I guess my question would be, if it's not, then what would be the right thing to do? I mean, this kind of seems like this is what you're supposed to do. We know what comes later, so it's easy to read that back into what's happening here and say, oh, well, they're just faking it or whatever. Maybe they are, maybe they're not. But at least at this point, they have a response that seems to match what God wants from people. Weeping, making sacrifices. But we'll see where it goes. Okay, I had some notes on here, just a few things to mention. Do note, if you're a Bible writer, you can scribble this down. The angel of the Lord is a frequent messenger of God throughout the book of Judges, as well as other places. But the story of Gideon will begin with the angel of the Lord appearing to Gideon. The story of Samson will begin with the angel of the Lord appearing to Samson's parents. So just for fun there. I won't say too much about this. We alluded to it earlier. We should, I guess, be careful to say nowhere in this text does it say the people were too afraid to drive out the people. But I think that's a pretty good inference, because it's always fear with these people, right? When the spies went into the land, what did they come back saying? People are too big, walls are too big, cities are too big. Okay, there was fear there that was bigger than their trust. Even with Goliath, everybody but David was afraid of Goliath. Okay, so if we can rightly infer that fear is the root cause of why chapter 1 unfolded the way that it did, then we need to notice in chapter 2, God does not take fear as like a valid excuse for disobedience. Fear is a very natural thing. We all are afraid. There are things that make us fearful, but we can't let that fear keep us from obeying and then think that God's going to understand. Because, well, I was just afraid. Here, they're equated. You were afraid. That's disobedience. That's breaking the covenant. Because fear kept them from obeying, obviously. You can be fearful and have enough trust to obey in spite of your fear, but not obeying because of fear is still not obeying. Steve?
Yeah, so some fear horses, some fear chariots, but, we trust in the Lord our God. And I would remind everybody, Barak and Deborah, after, was it Jabin? Mm-hmm. He had 900 chariots, and so I guess the point to be made here is can't we see ourselves in this? I mean, just look at what it is you fear and take a look at how it is you trust and what it is you trust. As children of God, we say we trust Him, and you not only say that because I struggle with it, mm-hmm. but I definitely think this was fear, and fear is what caused them to get into the nightmare situation that really this first chapter put the children of Israel in forever, because they would not obey. So I think it's an important point.
Yeah, and as thorns in your side, that's the phrase that gets used here. And just notice the I don't know what you want to call it, but the lingering effect. You can go all the way back to this moment in their history and how profoundly that affects the way that things develop.
Whenever I'm looking at the Old Testament, I'm always intrigued by the prophetic figures of the New Covenant. So what we have here, of course, is a portrayal in the physical revealing the spiritual. And so we've got a battle taking place physically. And what gets in the way? Not only fear, but complacency, the enjoyment of the fruit of the land, and so forth. And you could see God saying, be strong, be courageous. And those are exact same words that God uses in the New Covenant in Ephesians chapter 6. We're in a spiritual battle. Take your stand. Act like men. And so what we see is what they were suffering in the physical is what we suffer in the spiritual as we engage in the spiritual battle.
It's a pretty good segue here. Let's continue on in chapter 2 to verse 6 to 10, because I think this passage here has a lot to say for us, along the same lines of some of what Brian was saying. As we read, ask, what happens as time passes? How would you explain this phenomenon? And what do we learn from it? Chapter 2, verse 6 to 10, when Joshua had dismissed the people, the sons of Israel went each to his inheritance to possess the land. And we know how that went. But the people served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who survived Joshua, who had seen all the great work of the Lord, which he had done for Israel. Then Joshua the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110, and they buried him in the territory of his inheritance in Timnath-Heres in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gash. All that generation also were gathered to their fathers, and there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord, nor yet the work which he had done for Israel. Okay, what happens here? How would you explain this short synopsis of Israel's history from one generation, the generation of Joshua, to the generation of the judges? They forgot their history, Brian says. Yeah, so in Deuteronomy 6, verse 10, then it shall come about when the Lord your God brings you into the land which he swore to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give you great and splendid cities which you did not build, houses which all good things you did not fill, cisterns you did not dig, vineyards and olive trees you did not plant. You eat and are satisfied, then watch yourself that you do not forget the Lord who brought you from the land of Egypt out of the house of slavery. I think that describing what Albert says here, that there is the danger of comfort and enjoying the blessings that God has given and not remembering what about that. That seems to be the two things going together here in Judges 2. Yes, they were enjoying the fruits of the land, and then, Brian says they forgot their history. What specifically did they forget? So they forgot that God's in control. What else would you say they forgot? Michael, are you going to add to that?
I guess forgot what it was like to be slaves in Egypt, like how bad that was, so there's just kind of like they've adjusted to the new norm, kind of a thing.
So there's several aspects to this, so maybe starting with what Michael says, the memory of slavery still fresh for that earlier generation. The memory of the deliverance is still fresh for them, but now you have a generation that doesn't remember that really, and all they've ever known is waking up in houses they didn't build and, eating from vineyards they didn't plant, so on and so forth. This is a real thing. I remember a sermon by Ralph Walker. And if you know Ralph, it won't surprise you. He had 3 chairs that he brought out and set up. It was very prop-oriented, which you got to be someone like Ralph to be able to pull that off. I could never do that. But the idea is that there's 3 generations, and you see this in business. You see it in, in just worldly success as well as in spiritual success. The first generation builds it. They worked for it. It was their blood, sweat, and tears that went into it. And they worked for every penny they earned. The second generation saw all of that and maybe had a hand in some of it, but for the most part, it wasn't their blood, sweat, and tears going into it. And so they kind of inherit it, but they have an appreciation for it because they saw it happen. The third generation, that's like your trust fund babies. They've never worked a day in their life. They had no idea what it takes to build that business. And so by the time they're in control and they're in charge, what are they doing? They're making terrible decisions. They have no appreciation for, being efficient or being, smart with their money. They don't even know how to do that. You get the idea, right? I mean, there's something about being removed from that struggle, being removed and forgetting about the hard work that went into it, the battles that were fought. And that seems to be happening here, of course, with the overarching spiritual aspect of remembering God and his deliverance, and that being a key. But actually, later on in the text, we'll talk about how the people need to fight battles in order to remember and to know what that's like and to have an appreciation for what God has given them. Robert?
So the challenge, though, is that they're a fickle people, Exodus 17, verse 3, the people thirsted there for water on the way to Mount Sinai. The people complained against Moses, why is it you brought us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children? They were living with God, and they're still rebelling against him at that point. So I'm not sure we can just rely on the I forgot God argument only.
Yeah, yes, that's right. And again, aren't we the same way? I mean, even when we see it in front of our faces, we can still forget or still ignore. But I think this is important. And so I just had a few things here that all kind of go together. I think this passage here, we'll end with this, and then we'll pick up in verse 11 on Sunday. You see the importance of leadership, right? In the days of Joshua, in the days of the elders of Joshua, right? That leadership matters. It's not the silver bullet. It's not the, well, all you need is good leadership, and then, everybody will be what they're supposed to be. No. But the fact that Joshua was who he was made a big difference. And you continue to see that throughout the, the ebbs and flows of Israel and Judah's history, right? The good kings made a difference. Leadership matters, okay? But there's also, as I was alluding to, the importance of fighting battles. The fact that these people had been there, they'd been in the trenches, so to speak. They had seen the cost. They had seen God's deliverance with their own eyes. They had seen how hard it was to overcome their fear and walk through the Red Sea or to go up against the Amalekites. And they saw that victory won. And that made a difference. I wonder about that. Because, again, you think about generations and establishing faith and trusting God that transcends generations. I mean, maybe it's overdone. Maybe there's a stereotype that's unfair. But I think it's largely built on a reality. That you have oftentimes people that have become Christians as adults. And this is maybe to Michael's point. They know what it's like to grow up just surrounded by sin, to live as an adult, enslaved in sin, how horrible that is, in the worst way. They come out of that and they fought their battle to learn the truth, to know what's right, to resist sin, to maybe get over addiction or to get over whatever. And that gives them a strength and a fortitude as a Christian that is just so powerful. And on the other side, at least, again, it's not a general rule, but there's a tendency for someone, honestly, like me and many of you, that grew up seeing it, grew up being taught everything from when you first knew you were being taught anything. And you maybe don't have the same sort of struggle to learn the truth and to fight for it. And that can create a certain complacency. It can create kind of we assume that we're right, and there's not the same toughness that's only developed by fighting real spiritual battles. So what's the solution? Well, the solution is we all need to be fighting battles. We all need to be working hard and showing our kids what it means to work hard spiritually, to study, to pray, to make a real effort to do hard things and serving other people and making sacrifices for other people and reaching out to the lost. And the more comfortable and kind of taken for granted it becomes, well, then that's not going to stand much of a chance from generation to generation. But if we are all working hard to fight for it and be in the trenches all the time, then our children will see that, and they will. That'll make a difference on how they grow and how they develop. Yes, Steve?
I'm worried, Daniel, about the newer, younger generations as it regards authority in Scripture, as it regards obedience, as it regards what some would call wiggle room. The fact of the matter is that I think as generations move along, of course, there's always a time when you come back to the center, right? But I just see an attitude of complacency. I remember the battles my mother and dad fought, and my grandparents, the battles they fought over the simple idea of authority of Scripture. And I think it's important that we bring that back to our children and our grandchildren and make them understand you have to obey. You have to trust. Oh, wait, we sing a song, trust and obey, right? That is an important concept that our children have to learn, okay? Because there's no wiggle room. There's none. And to wiggle is to get off course. And to get off course is to be in the wrong relationship with the God of the universe. So I think it's important that we bring our children and bring people back to these fundamental, very important concepts.
And I'll just put what Steve said together with this. Notice that phrasing in the end of verse 10. The generation didn't know the Lord. That was the heart of the problem, okay? You can know about God without knowing God. And so I think you take what Steve's saying and take it as our responsibility to truly know the Lord, and then to teach our children to truly know the Lord. And we're passing down that fervent desire to understand God's will and to truly imprint it on our hearts, instead of just, well, this is kind of like what we do. We're kind of like a club, and we have some things some traditions we carry on. And yeah, I'd like my kids to do that, but if it's nothing more than that, then it's not going to go very far. So, all right, I intentionally put too much in this first lesson and not enough in the second lesson, so we would have room to fall short in lesson 1. So we'll pick up there in chapter 2, verse 11, and hopefully get all the way through chapter 3 on Sunday. Thank you, guys.